For decades, scientists operated on a fairly straightforward assumption about what would happen as Arctic sea ice disappeared. Less ice would mean more sunlight reaching the ocean surface, and more sunlight would mean more plankton, the microscopic algae sitting at the base of the entire Arctic food chain. More light, more growth. A relatively simple equation. A 20-year data set just proved that assumption wrong, and what's actually happening instead is stranger and considerably more consequential than anyone expected. The research comes from a team led by Professor Raja Ganeshram at the University of Edinburgh's School of Geosciences, published this year in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment. The team analyzed 2 decades of oceanographic sampling data, collected between 1998 and 2023 from the Fram Strait, a narrow marine passage between Greenland and the Norwegian archipelago of Svalbard, where Arctic waters drain directly into the North Atlantic. That stretch of ocean functions as something close to a choke point for the entire Arctic system. Water flowing out through the Fram Strait carries a chemical signature of what's actually happening across the wider Arctic Ocean behind it, making it one of the most useful places on the planet to track long-term changes in Arctic Ocean chemistry. What the data revealed is that nitrate, a nutrient every bit as essential to ocean life as fertilizer is to a farm field, has been steadily declining in the Arctic since around 2009. Nitrate is what plankton need to grow, the same way nitrogen-based fertilizer is what crops need to grow, and plankton sit directly beneath everything else in the Arctic food web: fish, seabirds, seals, whales. Take away enough nitrate, and you're not just looking at slightly smaller plankton populations. You're looking at a foundation problem that ripples upward through every single species, depending on that foundation to survive. Here's the mechanism driving this decline, and it's genuinely counterintuitive once you understand it. As Arctic sea ice disappears, sunlight reaches vast stretches of shallow coastal ocean that used to sit permanently shaded beneath a solid ice cover. Nearly half of the entire Arctic Ocean consists of these shallow coastal regions, so we're talking about an enormous area suddenly exposed to direct sunlight for the first time in the region's relatively recent history. More sunlight does initially produce exactly what you'd expect: larger algae blooms. But those blooms don't simply grow and support the food chain the way researchers assumed they would. Instead, they die off and sink down to the seafloor in unusually large quantities. As microbes on the ocean floor break down that sunken organic material, they consume the oxygen in the surrounding water to do it. That process creates localized oxygen pore zones on the shallow seafloor, and it's inside those specific low oxygen pockets that a process called benthic denitrification takes over. Specialized microorganisms living in those oxygen-starved conditions convert nitrate directly into nitrogen gas. And once that conversion happens, the nitrate doesn't just move somewhere else in the ocean, it disappears from the marine ecosystem entirely, released as gas into the atmosphere rather than remaining available as a nutrient in the water. Sit with the irony embedded in that mechanism for a moment. Losing sea ice was supposed to be, in a narrow sense, good news for Arctic marine productivity: more light, more growth. Instead, the exact same process, more sunlight reaching newly ice-free water, is triggering a chain reaction that actively destroys the nutrient that growth depends on in the first place. Professor Ganeshram and his team described the Arctic Ocean as having fundamentally shifted from what's called a light-limited system to a nitrate-limited one. For essentially the entire period, scientists have been studying this region in detail. The thing holding back plankton growth was insufficient sunlight, blocked by thick ice cover for most of the year. Now, with that light restriction removed, an entirely different constraint has taken over. There simply isn't enough nitrate left in the water to support the growth that additional sunlight would otherwise allow. The team's analysis points to 2009 as roughly the moment this shift began, a timeline that lines up closely with a period of accelerating sea ice loss across the Arctic more broadly. Since that year, nitrate concentrations in the Fram Strait have been on a consistent downward trajectory, tracked continuously through one of the most sustained, detailed oceanographic monitoring efforts conducted anywhere in the Arctic. 25 years of consistent sampling is what allows researchers to distinguish a genuine long-term regime shift from ordinary year-to-year variability, the kind of noise that could easily be mistaken for a real trend if you were only looking at a handful of years in isolation. If a discovery like this changes how you think about what less ice actually means for the Arctic, that's exactly the kind of deeper mechanism this channel exists to break down. So stick around, because the consequences of this shift reach considerably further than plankton alone. The most immediate visible consequence involves the size and type of plankton the Arctic can now support. Marta Santos Garcia, a marine biogeochemist at the University of Edinburgh and a co-author on the study, has pointed out that researchers have already observed a shift towards smaller phytoplankton species in parts of the Arctic, changes that hadn't previously been connected to nitrate loss specifically before this study made the link explicit. That distinction between larger and smaller plankton species matters enormously for everything further up the food chain. Larger phytoplankton tend to be considerably more efficient at transferring energy upward through the food web. Larger fish and other predators can feed on them more directly and effectively. Microplankton, the smaller species now becoming more dominant under nitrate-limited conditions, are generally far less efficient at that same energy transfer. Practically, that means less usable energy and food reaching larger plankton, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals further up the chain, even in years when total plankton biomass might look roughly comparable on paper. The quality and usability of that biomass, not just its raw quantity, is what's changing here. There's also a genuinely significant climate dimension to this story that extends well beyond the Arctic's own regional ecosystem. Phytoplankton require nitrate specifically to carry out photosynthesis, the same biological process through which they pull carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and lock it into their own cellular structure. When phytoplankton eventually die and sink to the ocean floor, a meaningful portion of that captured carbon gets buried in seafloor sediment, effectively removed from the atmosphere for a very long time, sometimes on a geological timescale. This process is one of the ocean's genuine natural climate regulation mechanisms, quietly pulling carbon out of circulation year after year. A nitrate-starved Arctic Ocean, producing fewer, smaller phytoplankton overall, is a meaningfully weaker version of that same carbon capturing system, precisely in a region where the broader effects of climate change are already advancing faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. Perhaps the most sobering detail in the entire study is the word researchers keep returning to when describing this shift: irreversible. Because this transformation is driven directly by ongoing, continuing sea ice loss, rather than some temporary, self-correcting weather pattern, the research team considers it highly unlikely the Arctic Ocean will ever revert back to its previous nitrate-rich state, at least not on any timescale remotely relevant to policy decisions being made today. That's a meaningfully different, more serious claim than saying an ecosystem is simply under stress or facing a difficult stretch. It's a claim that a fundamental structural transformation has already taken hold, one that will keep shaping this ecosystem going forward, regardless of what specific weather pattern any individual year happens to bring. It's worth being precise and fair about the genuine scientific uncertainty still surrounding exactly how this cascades further up the Arctic food web, because that's honestly where the most consequential open questions currently sit. The study itself establishes the chemical mechanism, sea ice loss driving benthic denitrification, driving nitrate decline, with real confidence, built on 2 decades of consistent, carefully collected data. What remains considerably less certain is precisely how smaller, lower-quality plankton populations will ultimately affect specific fish stocks, seabird colonies, and marine mammal populations across different parts of the Arctic and the wider North Atlantic. Professor Ganeshram has been explicit that this cascading effect needs to be closely monitored going forward, rather than treated as a fully settled, already understood outcome. Researchers are being appropriately careful here, not to overstate a specific, precise ecological forecast beyond what the current data can actually support, while still being direct and clear about the seriousness of the underlying chemical shift itself, which is exactly the kind of honest calibration that separates a credible scientific finding from a bigger, less careful headline. If tracking exactly how these connected ocean and ice systems are shifting is the kind of grounded science breakdown you find valuable, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making it. This finding also sits alongside a broader wave of polar research, published this same year, adding to a growing picture of both the Arctic and Antarctic undergoing significant measurable transformation simultaneously, each through its own distinct mechanism specific to that region's particular geography and ocean chemistry. The practical stakes extend directly into human economic activity too, not just the abstract health of a remote marine ecosystem most people will never personally witness. Ganeshram has specifically flagged commercial fishing across the North Atlantic as an area with real, tangible exposure to these changes. Arctic waters connect directly to major North Atlantic fishing grounds through ocean currents and the migratory patterns of numerous commercial fish species, meaning a fundamental shift in the productivity and nutritional quality of the Arctic food web's base doesn't necessarily stay neatly contained within the Arctic Circle itself. Fish populations that spend part of their life cycle in or near Arctic waters, or that depend on migratory prey species that do, could feel downstream effects from this shift, even if the fish themselves are ultimately caught and sold thousands of miles from the Fram Strait, where this specific research was conducted. This finding also connects to a broader pattern of Arctic research, suggesting the region may be approaching, or already crossing, multiple tipping points simultaneously across entirely different physical and chemical systems at once. Separate research teams have documented the Arctic warming at roughly 4 times the global average rate, driven by the same underlying sea ice loss and the albedo feedback loop it triggers, reflective ice disappearing and being replaced by darker, heat-absorbing open ocean. Other researchers running climate simulations have projected the Arctic could experience its first entirely ice-free summer day as early as 2027, a specific, sobering marker that once felt like a distant hypothetical future scenario and now sits within a genuinely near-term forecasting window. Considered together, a warming feedback loop reshaping the physical ice cover, and a separate chemical feedback loop now confirmed to be reshaping the ocean's fundamental nutrient balance underneath it, paint a picture of an Arctic system being restructured across multiple compounding dimensions at once, not experiencing a single, isolated change in any one variable alone. It helps to understand a bit more about why sea ice loss and sunlight exposure translate so directly into this specific chemical outcome, rather than simply warming the water in some general diffuse way. Sea ice doesn't just block light passively the way a curtain blocks a window, it also insulates the water beneath it from direct atmospheric and solar energy almost entirely for much of the year, keeping shallow coastal seafloor environments in a stable, low-light, low-productivity state for centuries. When that ice disappears for extended stretches of the year, it's not a small incremental change to those shallow ecosystems. It's closer to a light switch flipping on in a room that's stayed dark for generations. The intensity of that shift is part of why the resulting algae blooms have been large enough to meaningfully deplete seafloor oxygen when they die and sink, rather than simply representing a modest, easily absorbed increase in biological activity. Shallow water depth compounds this effect too, since a shorter distance between the surface and the seafloor means sinking organic material reaches the bottom more quickly and in a more concentrated way than it would in deeper ocean water, where material has more time and distance to disperse and break down gradually on the way down. The monitoring methodology behind this discovery deserves real credit too, because of finding this significant depended entirely on the kind of unglamorous, sustained data collection that rarely makes headlines on its own. Collecting comparable, scientifically rigorous water chemistry samples from the same general region of the Arctic Ocean, consistently across 25 years, required sustained research vessel access to a genuinely difficult, often ice-choked stretch of ocean, year after year, through changing funding environments and shifting research priorities. Many significant long-term environmental trends are only detectable at all because some research institution or team committed to that kind of unglamorous, sustained data collection long before anyone understood exactly what pattern that data would eventually reveal. The Fram Strait sampling program is a clear example of that longer-term institutional patience paying off. 25 years of unspectacular water chemistry sampling, method by method, cruise by cruise, ultimately revealing one of the more consequential Arctic ecosystem findings published this year. There's a specific reason the Fram Strait made such a valuable location for uncovering this particular shift, beyond simply being convenient for research vessels to reach and sample repeatedly over 2 decades, because it functions as the Arctic Ocean's primary outflow gateway into the North Atlantic. Water chemistry measured consistently at that single choke point over time offers a genuinely representative signal of conditions across a much broader stretch of the Arctic system, without requiring research teams to sample dozens of separate, harder-to-reach locations scattered throughout the entire region. That's part of why 25 years of consistent data collection at this one specific location was able to reveal a slow, gradual regime shift that might have remained genuinely difficult to detect through more scattered, short-term sampling efforts spread across a wider, less consistently monitored area. It's also worth placing this discovery within the broader context of how ocean nutrient cycles work generally. Since nitrate limitation isn't a uniquely Arctic phenomenon, it's actually the default condition across much of the world's open ocean. Vast stretches of tropical and subtropical ocean have operated as nitrate-limited systems for as long as scientists have studied them, which is part of why those regions tend to appear as comparatively barren, clear blue water on satellite imagery, supporting far less biological productivity than nutrient-rich coastal waters or the cold, historically nitrate-abundant polar oceans. What makes the Arctic's shift genuinely notable isn't that nitrate limitation itself is some novel, previously unseen phenomenon in ocean science. It's that one of the planet's historically most nitrate-rich, most productive marine regions is now actively transitioning into that more limited category, essentially trading places with the kind of ocean chemistry usually associated with far less biologically productive waters. That's a meaningfully different kind of story than documenting decline within an already resource-poor system. It's watching a genuinely rich ecosystem's underlying chemistry fundamentally downgrade in real time, tracked with enough precision to identify almost the exact year the transition began. So, where does this leave the broader picture? A 20-year Arctic research effort has revealed that the ecosystem's most basic foundational chemistry may have already crossed a threshold. It's unlikely to naturally cross back over, driven by a genuinely counterintuitive mechanism where the very process expected to help Arctic marine life, more open water, more available sunlight, is instead actively working against it through an unexpected chain of chemical reactions playing out on the seafloor. The full downstream consequences for fish, seabirds, and marine mammals across the Arctic and North Atlantic remain an active, ongoing area of research. But the underlying chemical shift itself now rests on 2 solid decades of consistent, carefully collected evidence. As one of the study's own co-authors put it directly, this represents a fundamental change with genuinely far-reaching consequences for marine ecosystems, food chains, and even the Arctic's broader role in the planet's climate system. We'll continue following this research as scientists work to understand exactly how far this chemical shift cascades through the wider Arctic food web. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.